You truly can overcome imposter syndrome. And I've listened to a couple of YouTube videos that talk about this, and they say that you'll never really get over it. But I think there's a big misunderstanding there, which I'm going to share with you. And I truly think you can fully overcome imposter syndrome. And I'm doing this video and I want to encourage you to do this work because I want to see you achieve your true potential, shine your light bright, and the world needs you. All right, let's get into it. And today I'm going to share the 3 things I'd like you to understand about imposter syndrome. And then we're going to talk about some practical tools, very implementable, like steps you can take. And then also a little bit about the deeper healing needed. So stay tuned. If you end up liking this, please do give it a like and share it with somebody you think it may help. All right, let's get into it. So there are 3 things that I think it's critically important to understand about imposter syndrome, because understanding this can then help you take the steps to feel better and eventually fully overcome imposter syndrome. So the first thing to bring to mind is that imposter syndrome has fear in it. It has an anxiety. It's not just that feeling that you can't cut it or that your skills aren't good enough. It's a feeling of being a fraud, a concern about being found out, right? So it goes beyond self doubt, self confidence, or self esteem issues, right? It ties into I'm going to be found out, I'm going to be exposed, and then, oh no, whatever it is you fear will happen. So that part of it is an anxiety, and it's really important to understand that because you can then begin to work with some general anxiety tools to calm the anxiety down. Because we always want to tackle imposter syndrome by feeling better and more confident and all that stuff, and I do think we can do that. But we can't ignore that there's this fear piece that probably is really, really old instinctual fear in us because our survival is dependent on others. It clearly is. And many, many, many years ago in early human evolution, we were really dependent on a small group to support us. Now, if you lose a job, you probably can find another job, right? But in a hunter-gatherer society, if you were excluded from the group, your life would literally be in danger. So I do think there's sort of a very innate, ingrained fear of being excluded from a group or exposed, embarrassed, right? So that fear is underneath imposter syndrome. So that's one thing to recognize, because recognizing it also can help you go through the what ifs. And I know for some people this is very hard to do, but other people can do it. So it's like, okay, so let's say they call me out as a fraud. Well, then what? Okay, well, then maybe I think a lot of people fear, well, then I'll lose my job. Okay, so then what? Well, then maybe I'll never find another job. Okay, well, then what? Well, then I'll be homeless on the street, right? But once you identify that as anxiety, you can identify those things as projections and then come back to, is there anything that really should be causing me so much fear at this moment? And if you can at least put a bit of a question mark in there and lower that fear feeling, you'll make major progress on this. Okay, we'll come back to that. The second thing to understand about imposter syndrome is that it really is based on shame, right? It's based on a feeling of like, I'm not good enough. It usually is not only I'm not good enough at this job. Because if it was only I'm not good enough at this job, then I can look at the evidence in a realistic way and maybe I could say, you know what? This job really doesn't fit my skills and I'd be better off elsewhere. Or it could be, nah, my skills really fit this job. I'm actually pretty good at it. I can tell because of my work history, and then I'm over it. But it's usually imposter syndrome is usually based on some deep-seated feeling of not being enough, not being competent enough, smart enough, sort of a pervasive feeling. So guilt is sort of, I did something wrong, right? Like, so I made a mistake at work. That's doing something wrong. But like, I'm wrong. That's shame. So that's the second thing to understand, because that's something that we'll need to heal to get over imposter syndrome. And the third thing to understand about imposter syndrome is that these feelings are deeply embedded in your emotional brain. The mammalian part of our brain, the emotional brain, we can call it a number of different things, but it holds on to concepts and feelings and patterns from very early in our lives. And then changing those patterns, concepts, feelings doesn't respond all that well to our frontal lobe, which says, like, hey, you got this, it's no problem, look at your accomplishments. So, a lot of the practical tools that are shared about getting over imposter syndrome, and I am going to share some of these practical tools, but those are really frontal brain tools and they can help shift the emotional brain. But really, this might require some deeper work. And I do have a free webinar, if you haven't seen it, about rewiring your brain for joy and confidence, which takes some time, but it's very helpful to understand why we need this rewiring and why things got embedded in that emotional brain so deeply and so strongly so long ago. So feel free to join me for that. There's a link in the description to the video. So I want to come back to when I said that I believe you can fully recover from imposter syndrome. And so many people say that you can't. It's kind of always sort of going to be with you. You just manage it. I want to explain why I feel the way I do. And part of that is based on my own personal experience as well as all the people I've worked with over the last couple of decades. But if we think of those components of imposter syndrome, right? The anxiety, fear piece of it, the shame, and then that old emotional brain stuff, we can rewire that stuff. We truly can. And that does not mean that you'll never feel a moment of self doubt, right? But feeling self doubt or being in a new job or once in a while feeling overwhelmed and not sure you can cut it, those are like momentary, normal feelings that happen. And those feelings will happen to all of us because, well, there might be some people to whom those never happen, but generally, I'd say most of us feel insecure at times, maybe inadequate or not quite up to a job at some times. And if those are sort of momentary feelings, they happen in a particular situation, and they're not tied to this kind of feeling of being found out and exposed and humiliated, well, then it's not imposter syndrome. It's more tied to self esteem, which can be improved. But also, as I said, like some amount of that kind of self doubt is always going to be with us. That's okay. But that doesn't mean that imposter syndrome is always going to be with us. It also doesn't mean that if you have pervasive low self esteem, you can improve that. I do think you can recover from having pervasive low self esteem. Let me know. Give me a comment below. Sometimes I make these connections and I'm not sure I'm explaining it just right. So I'd love to know if that makes sense to you, that once in a while feeling low self-esteem or feeling bad about yourself or unsure, no big deal. It's when it's a pervasive pattern in the brain. And that's what I believe you can recover from. Okay, so I'm going to share 5 practical tips for overcoming imposter syndrome. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit of the deeper healing that might be needed. So, the number one tool, I call this look at the evidence. And there's a couple of supporting practices for this. But looking at the evidence is to really write down, really think through what's the evidence that you know what you're doing? What's the evidence that you're good at your job or you're good in this role? Working with a couple of people recently, one person was a nurse who had been working in an emergency room for more than 10 years, and she still had this imposter syndrome feeling of like, I don't really know what I'm doing. Now, being in an emergency room environment, I imagine there's a lot of time that the nurses and the doctors don't always know 100% what's going on, right? So they have to try this, try that, and like figure it out. So a little bit of that feeling, I think, probably goes with that environment. Stakes are high and things are uncertain, but in no way does that tie to being a fraud or not being capable. So when this person went through her evidence with me, she was like, well, I've had 3 different jobs. I've gotten promoted at every one. I've never had trouble finding a new job, and I've never been fired. So that's a lot of evidence that you're very competent, right? Another person I was speaking with recently who is suffering from this, she said when we went through the evidence thing, she's like, well, my clients tell me how much I'm helping them. And I said, well, what evidence do they give you? And she's like, well, they'll give me specifics of how I help them. And some of them write me really nice notes. And I have a lot of evidence that I'm actually helping them. So I recommended to her, and this is one of those other techniques, to create a file, like put into a particular, it could be a physical file, it could be a file on your computer. Put in there the compliments that you get, the gratitude you get from the people you're helping. Put in there your achievements at work, right? So you could call this a brag file. Some people call it a hype file. I actually do keep a file of some of the comments I'll get on YouTube. Like if somebody tells me specifically how it helped them and is very grateful, it's a really nice reinforcing reminder when I'm doing this work. It's very motivating, right? So I do keep a little bit of a file like that. So keep an evidence file. So that's the first tool. Second tool, take compliments in. If somebody gives you a compliment, it could be about anything, don't push it off. Bring it in, say thank you, express gratitude, and if you can, acknowledge it. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you get complimented at work for leading a major project, right? Leading a team through a major project, and you accomplish something, right? So if you get a compliment on that, don't just say, oh, it wasn't me, it was my great team. You can say, thank you. I worked really, really hard and I couldn't have done it without this great team. So it doesn't mean you have to brag or take all the credit yourself. But yeah, you put hard work in so you can acknowledge that. It can be an and, not an or. So take compliments in, acknowledge them, allow yourself to feel them, and over time that will be very helpful. Tip number 3, practice saying I don't know. If you don't know something, don't practice if you do know it, but practice if you don't know something, saying I don't know. And you can make it active and positive by saying, I'm not sure about that, but I will look into it and get back to you. Or let me double check on something. I really want to make sure I'm giving you the right answer and I will get back to you tomorrow or a week from Monday or whatever the time frame is that gives you enough time to find the answer. Or if it's something you'll never have an answer for, you can figure out how to say that. Sometimes what people really need are for us to ask them questions, particularly if you're in the helping field. People don't need an answer. They usually need, well, they might want an answer, but even if you give them an answer, they won't be happy with it. People really benefit from being asked the right questions and being led through a process so you don't have to know the answers all the time. So that's number 3. Say I don't know if you don't know, and be okay with that. And understand also, like, nobody knows everything. It's okay not to know. Number 4, acknowledge that you are comparing your insides, how you feel inside, to other people's outsides. So you are comparing the self-doubt that you feel to what other people are projecting. And what other people are projecting is frequently not a reflection of how they feel. So you might work with somebody who seems like they always are on top of things, they know exactly what they're doing, and that person might collapse in tears at the end of the day because they feel so stressed because they're pretending all day. We don't know. I do think that's sort of a benefit of the job that I have, is that I do learn about people's insides. And I'll tell you, we are all way more alike than different. And if you're having internal feelings, those people probably are as well. Some of this is sort of normal and is, occasionally going to occur, but at least acknowledge to yourself that you are judging yourself internally based on what you feel and using an external comparison of how somebody is presenting. And then tool number 5 is to calm yourself down in the moment, right? If we go back to the fact that imposter syndrome is actually a fear and an anxiety, one of the best things you can do when you're feeling it is to use some simple tools for anxiety, like diaphragmatic breathing. Really helps to set you, really helps to reset you physiologically. Diaphragmatic breathing, grounding exercises, taking a break if you need it, doing something to deal with the anxious feelings that go along with that. You can do that in the moment. So those are 5 in the moment tips. And now I want to talk about the deeper healing, because we're talking about really healing the root of imposter syndrome. And if you can heal the root of imposter syndrome, you'll never have to feel it again. Really. Again, you might have that self-doubt once in a while, but it won't be tied to the overwhelming feelings of shame and the overwhelming negative thoughts about yourself that are deeply embedded in your subconscious or emotional brain. So how do you go about that? This is the part you can't necessarily get from a YouTube video. Just being honest with you, because everybody wants solutions. But some of these things take time. And yeah, sometimes it takes working with a therapist for sure. Working with somebody who can help you validate your own emotions, help you validate your own successes, and help you develop a really strong inner coaching voice. So sometimes it is required to work with somebody else, particularly on the issue of shame, because shame is so much about feeling we are fundamentally flawed, like really on a deep level. And if we have that degree of shame, it can be very hard to get out of that by yourself. But whether you work with this on a self-help way and maybe have a couple of friends you can check in with on that level, because that would be helpful, or whether you work with a professional, either one, know this is going to take time and it's going to take healing. So those negative beliefs we have about ourselves, they form really, really early, which is why a lot of the advice you get these days on topics like imposter syndrome talk about, oh, change how you think, or change these 2 or 3 things, or whatever. That's all frontal lobe stuff. It's not really changing it on a deep level. So I do have a PDF that you can download that I believe is very helpful for identifying what your negative core belief is, and it gives you 3 ways to begin to practice to overturn that belief. So that PDF is available through a link in the description to this video. If you haven't yet downloaded it, I definitely recommend it. And when you've identified your negative core belief, then beginning to work to reinforce the positive core belief that counters it. Now, this is a concept that's used in CBT therapy. It's used a lot in EMDR therapy. Many of you know I have some videos on EMDR, which is a technique I really support. I find it super powerful, but you can also work with these techniques on your own. So working to heal these negative core beliefs on a deep level, right, and replacing them with reasonably stated positive core beliefs is the work that over time will heal that shame. And I want to combine this with a comment about both the big T and the little t traumas of childhood, right? A lot of us have little t ongoing traumas or negative events that impacted our sense of self. And we almost always can tie these core negative beliefs, the ones that are really deeply embedded in there, to a handful of experiences when we were kids. So that stuff needs to be healed as well. So good news, bad news on imposter syndrome and overcoming it is that you can do it. Totally, completely, you can do it. It is going to take time. It's going to take enacting some of these tools that I talked about, the kind of more surface ones, things you can do now, and it will take the deeper healing work. But you are worth it. You can do it, and you're worth it. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do give me a like. It helps a lot. Subscribe to my channel if you're not subscribed, and stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you next week.